Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am Deepak, joining you from India and delighted to host today's episode. We are honored to welcome Dr. Monomita Nandy as the distinguished guest for today's episode. Dr. Monomita Nandy is currently a professor in accounting and finance at Brunel Business School, Brunel University of London, UK. Professor Nandy is a senior academic leader, having served as Vice Dean International, Director of Internationalization, and Director of Postgraduate Programs alongside other strategic leadership roles. She holds two PhDs from University of Calcutta, India, and University of Rome Tor Vergata, Italy, and is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences. Her career spans academic and research roles across the UK, Europe, the US, including Lely Business School, New York, and leading institutes in India. Widely admired by students, she is a multiple recipient of Student Lead Best Teacher Awards and is recognized for innovative technology-enabled teaching. Dr. Nandy's research bridges digitalization for the Sustainable Development Goals and emerging issues in corporate finance, with publications in high-impact international journals. She also served as an associate editor for leading journals like the International Journal of Finance and Economics, Business Strategy and the Environment, International Journal of Finance Studies, presents regularly at major conferences, and contributes to policy and public debate through consultations with bodies such as the Financial Reporting Council, UN EU Commission, and the HM Revenue and Customs, work that attracts record media attention. Dr. Nandy holds key sector and university roles, including Chair of the British Accounting and Finance Association's South East Group, Vice Chair Research Engagement at Europe India Centre for Business and Industry, Member Champion of the IMA TSP Committee, USA, Board Member of the Centre for AI, and Lab Lead at Brunel Centre for Entrepreneurship and Sustainability. She advises organizations in the UK and internationally attracts external funding and drives recognized student-industry collaborations that deliver measurable social and economic impact. Today, Dr. Monomita Nandy joins us to discuss her research, Blind Spot, integrating biodiversity into corporate risk management. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Monomita Nandy to the podcast. Professor Nandy, we deeply appreciate your gracious acceptance of our invitation. It's an honor and privilege to host you today.
Thank you. Thank you, Deepak, for having me on the podcast and also for your warm welcome. And I think it's a privilege to join this conversation because the way we think about biodiversity today will shape the economic and definitely the social stability of tomorrow. So it is really important to discuss about this topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development described biodiversity as a blind spot for business. How do you explain this idea to a CEO who still thinks of nature as an externality rather than a core asset?
Oh, okay. It's a great question, Deepak. Let me think how to frame my answer over here. So, in simple words, a CEO who is still saying a nature as an externality, what they're trying to say is that nature is something out there. I'm least bothered about it, and it is separate from my balance sheet. So, this type of understanding by a CEO will give you some idea about why OECD is pointing out biodiversity as a blind spot. Actually, what is happening that most of the businesses don't realize that how deeply their operations, their supply chains, and even their I would say long-term resilience that depends on this living system until those systems start to fail, right? So why biodiversity is a blind spot? If you ask me how I would explain this to a CEO to motivate them to understand this important issue in their business, I would explain it to a CEO in the same way I would explain them the hidden risk in financial portfolios. So there are different hidden risks, right? So you don't notice the exposure until the shock hits. It's very common in the financial market, right? And by the time you realize that there is a shock that's going to hit or is disturbing your business performance, it becomes very expensive how to deal with it, right? So most companies, you will see that they would like to track the energy cost. They also track the labor cost, regulatory cost, but they rarely track the value they are extracting or they would be able to extract from functioning in the ecosystem that composed of clean water, then flood protection, stable soils, pollination, genetic resources, and even sometimes the cultural licenses to operate in certain regions. So there are several other things. So these are a couple of components of the ecosystem I'm referring to. So these are not nice to have options now for the business. They are invisible infrastructure, I think, that keeps those business running. I think you would agree with me on this. And I can give you some real world examples over here that if you go back a few years, you will see that there were lots of discussion around the cocoa industry in West Africa because deforestation and biodiversity loss, what was affecting this region a lot, and it's not only in West Africa; it's almost everywhere around the world these days. So the those deforestation activities by human being and not taking care of the biodiversity properly, what happened that it affected the rainfall patterns, and that actually damaged the soil quality. And at the end, you can see as a result, we saw declining yields of the products. Even in automotive sector, if you think about that, that sector was also badly affected by unexpected extreme events, weather events, I would say. For example, in Thailand, we have seen that different part suppliers were completely wiped out. And do you know that what are the root cause of this? These are actually loss of wetlands that once was absorbing the flood water. So you can say that nature is actually quietly providing us, when I say us means businesses, a free risk management service, I would say. And there is a capacity, right? So nature cannot keep us providing this service again throughout our time. We have to also take certain steps to take care of the nature. Otherwise, nature would fail in protecting us, which is happening these days. Um, I can give one example from UK water company. I would not like to mention any name, but there are certain incidents where we have seen the companies are investing millions in artificial filtration because the upstream biodiversity loss is affecting the rivers, and the river water which we use for drinking water purpose, then the rivers cannot naturally purify the water. So the externality is actually coming back as a capital expenditure line for the businesses. So so why I am giving those examples, if you ask me. So I was trying to show that this biodiversity loss doesn't stay outside the business model. It walks straight into your operational risk, and it will affect your cost volatility, and that would definitely affect your brand reputation. So, if any company CEO is still not considering biodiversity in their business model, I would like to say to them that if your business depends on nature, and almost all the businesses are very much dependent on nature, so every business somehow they are dependent, then biodiversity is not a cost, it is an asset, and you are drawing down on without replenishing. So no CFO could would allow that financial capital, right? So a CEO who thinks in terms of assets, liabilities, and definitely risk exposure would immediately understand this framing, and biodiversity becomes part of this enterprise risk management. It's no more the CSR things only. So what we need to do, we need a shift in the mindset. So the most forward-looking companies are already treating nature like an infrastructure, and they map their dependencies, invest in £1 million in their ecosystem restoration, and they are building. There are several examples. Because of time constraint, we cannot explain all the give all the examples, but there are several examples where the companies are building kind of nature positive supply chain because they can see the competitive advantage, and they don't see anymore this as a compliance. So the question is no longer should we care about biodiversity, it's can we afford not to. So this is the way I would like to explain to any CEO about the importance of biodiversity in their business.
Very insightful. Professor, building on the World Bank's warning that we have crossed the planetary boundary for fresh water, with both green water and blue water under sustainable pressure. What does the often cited dependency of the economy on water and ecosystem functions look like in concrete sector level terms? For example, ec- agriculture, food value chains, energy and cooling, manufacturing and cities. And when rainfall becomes more erratic, natural storage declines and water quantity deteriorates.
Mhm. Yeah, so before I answer to your question, can I just confirm that when you refer to green water, do you mean by soil moisture and rainfall? I think you are
Yes,
referring to
yes, correct,
that type of thing. And blue water means the river, lakes, and the water from where we get the drinking water and all those things. Yeah,
right.
I just want to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. Thank you. So, when we talk about crossing the planetary boundary for fresh water, it sometimes sounds very abstract, all right? But the impacts are incredibly concrete because what it really means is that water cycle is the quite engine, I would say, behind the global economy. We depend on water a lot, and this global economy depends on water a lot. So it's no longer behaving in the predictable way businesses have always assumed. So it's a really, really big concern for businesses and the world economy. For example, if we talk about agriculture, so many countries around the world are depending on agricultural product, and the main economic activity is dependent on agriculture. So can you imagine what will happen if to our food cycle when the soil will stop acting like a sponge? It's dangerous. If you think carefully, it is really dangerous situation. Because in agriculture, the biggest shock is not always drought. Usually, if you ask anyone that what is the biggest shock you have seen in the agriculture, they would easily say, oh, drought, no rainwater. But that's not the case. It is actually the loss of the soil's ability to hold water, like the previous example that I was giving. So farmers told me that the same rainfall they used to rely on before, now either there is no rainwater, or they arrive all at once. So they are finding it very difficult to depend on the natural rainwater for agricultural activities. Even I was talking with, in one of my research, I was talking with a couple of farmers in different countries. And in one Asian countries, when I was talking with a couple of farmers, they explained it very nicely that they said, I still remember that they said the rain still comes, but the soil doesn't remember it. So it is that dangerous now. So and as they were explaining in the local language and in very simple way. So it kind of gave me a shock that how difficult it is for them. And so when this green water disappears, the crops will become more dependent on irrigation system, then which will then put lots of pressure on blue water. So that's how you get this cascading failures. So crop losses, price spikes, and then supply chain instability. These are very common things these days, isn't it? So we have seen that in India, we have seen people complaining about the price rise in onions are very expensive. It's not only in India or Asian continent; it's everywhere. Like very recently, I have seen lots of discussion around coffee price in Ethiopia, and the whole supply chain was affected. So the coffee price was increasing everywhere because if you think about the European and European continent, they depends a lot on the African continent for coffee, and even potatoes, which is a very common product all over the world. So the potato price was becoming very bad in the European region. Um, so it's really difficult situation. And if we think about the impact of water in the energy sector, the energy sector heavily depends on water for cooling purpose, right? And I would say that water is kind of a hidden fuel in the energy sector. If you won't realize that now, means you are doing a big mistake in your business model. So most CEOs think of energy in terms of gas, wind, or solar power, but when it comes to renewable energy powers and all those things, but water is the invisible fuel behind this whole system. And when the rivers run low or get too warm, what will happen? The power plants can't cool their system. So, if you remember a few summers ago in France, the nuclear plants had to scale back their production because the river water was too hot to use safely. And that wasn't a climate story, it was actually an energy security story. Then, if you think about the hydropower, it becomes a gamble actually when the natural storage like snowpacks, glaciers, wetlands, these are shrinking day by day. One province in China, I remember, that had to shut down their factories because hydropower output collapsed during drought. And that's what the water stress looks like in a modern industrial economy. And we have also seen adverse effect of water quality on manufacturing sector. So the manufacturers often assume that water will always be available and it's clean, it's a cheaper raw material. But if you think about the quality of the water, when the water quality is getting bad, it's becoming a major operational risk. Semiconductors plants in Taiwan to truck in water actually during the drought years. So imagine the irony over here. The world's most advanced chips are depending on water deliveries by lorry. Isn't it a really scary situation for all of us. Then, if you go back to the textile factories in South Asia, they face shutdowns not because of labor issues, but because the polluted rivers cannot supply the quality of water that they needed in this industry. So I think water becomes both a cost and also a compliance headache. And uh, do you know what is the slow burning crisis of modern cities? I think this is really interesting there because it's simply the water. So cities feel water stress in two ways. Either there is too little or too much. So, for example, Mexico City is sinking because groundwater extraction is exceeding the natural recharge. And very recently, you might have seen Cape Town was really nearly ran out of water. Can you imagine Cape Town, like a big city, it was running out of water. And in the UK, we are seeing more flash floods almost every month. And thank God today is sunny. And finally, we started getting feel like springtime. So, but UK is getting too many flash floods because of degraded landscapes that cannot absorb the rainwater. So, what is happening when this natural storage declines? The cities lose their buffer and insurance premium rise, infrastructure strengths are happening, and planning authorities needs to start restricting new developments. We have seen so many new developments have been stopped because they simply can't guarantee the water supply in that region. So, the message that I want to give to any business would be that your business doesn't just use water, it depends on the stability, I would say, of the entire water cycle. And that cycle is now disturbed. So, when rainfall becomes erratic, when soils start losing their sponge function, rivers run low or polluted, the whole economy fails in a very sector specific, and the economy feels that um, it may be very sector specific or very expensive ways to deal with those problems. So it is definitely not an environmental issue sitting outside your business model. So it is an operational and definitely financial, because if something goes wrong, you have to fix that. And it's a strategic issue actually sitting right at the center of your business. So that is my message to the businesses through your podcast. Thank you.
Professor, in your research, you have worked with a substantial cross-country data set. For example, in one of your recent studies, you analyzed more than 2,600 firms across 42 countries over several years to assess how companies frame their environmental and biodiversity commitments. Based
Yeah.
on this large and diverse data set, what did you learn about the gap between what firms commit to and what they actually deliver? And which of those findings genuinely surprised you the most?
Oh, thank you for asking this question. So, data is always a challenge, right? So, when you work with a data set as large and diverse as the one we analyzed, what you mentioned here, this is one of our working papers where we worked with used 2,600 firms across 42 countries over several years, and you start to see a pattern, because if you are not dealing with a big data set, you can't see the pattern. And that you cannot simply detect when you're working on a single country or single industry study. So, and one of the most striking things is how differently the firms behave depending on on the regulatory environment, the industry they are operating in, and also the cultural expectations around environmental responsibility, because the cultural expectations are very different in different countries. So, for example, if you take a farm operating in Scandinavia, for example, faces a completely different set of expectations and reporting norms than a farm in Southeast Asia or Latin America. So, in some countries, environmental disclosure is tightly regulated. In others, I would say it's largely voluntary, and that shapes not only what companies report, but how ambitious they feel when they need to be. So, what from our database, what surprised me most was that environmental commitments, especially the board, the high level ones, tend to look quite consistent across countries when it comes to environmental commitment. But the actual performance are different sharply once you factor in local enforcement, or if you consider industry pressures and resource constraint, you can see different types of performance. But commitment wise, is quite similar. So definitely there are industry specific realities, because different sectors face different challenges, right? A mining company, a tech farm, or a food producer maybe may all talk about environment stewardship, but the operational implications, I would say, are very different. For example, a food company might be dealing with soil degradation and water scarcity. A manufacturing firm might be struggling with waste treatment or energy efficiency. And a financial service firm might be focusing on portfolio level climate risk. So, when we compare commitments with performance, we have seen that the differences are there. So we have to recognize that the distance between the two is shaped mainly by the sectoral physical realities. And the most surprising part is environment versus the biodiversity. So, one of the clearest findings, I would say, from the data set we were dealing with, and this is just for one paper, but we are dealing with several big databases for different projects. So, when companies talk about general environmental commitments like how to say waste management, carbon reduction, then energy efficiency, there is often a reasonably close link between what they are saying and what they are doing. But when we look specifically at biodiversity commitment, the picture becomes much more blurred. So, and this is not because companies don't care. I'm not at all saying that companies don't care. It's because biodiversity is very, very hard to measure. It's harder to standardize, and it's really hard to translate to KPIs that board feels comfortable reporting on. When you read the reports, you will see a company can say that we reduce emission by X percentage, right? But how do you say that we improve the biodiversity by X%? So it's a little bit difficult. It's not little difficult, it's really, really difficult. And there is no universal metric, no single baseline, and no global reporting framework that firms need feel confidently they are feeling confident in using that. So I can give you a real world illustration. In one region we studied, farms were very vocal about habitat protection. So we checked each and individual report to understand, and then we went back to those companies' profile and we checked the details. But when we looked at the actual disclosure, the reporting was very vague. They were using the phrases like supporting local ecosystem or promoting biodiversity awareness. These were some of them which I remember now. So but these were with very little quantifiable evidence behind them. But contrast with that, their carbon reporting, which was detailed, it was audited and year on year comparable. So that gap actually between clarity on climate and vagueness on biodiversity was one of the most consistent pattern we found across countries and industries. So I want to really give a message to the research community here, because I know that your podcast is very popular among research community. And one thing is dataset made absolutely clear is that we need far more research on biodiversity commitment. The academic community has done a tremendous amount of work on climate reporting, carbon markets, carbon credit, environmental performance, but biodiversity is still treated as as the younger sibling, I would say, in sustainability research, and it is important, but it's really less developed. So though biodiversity loss is accelerating faster than many climate indicators, you would not imagine that how fast it is. And farms are increasingly being asked to demonstrate that nature positive strategies. And if we don't build the evidence base now across countries, sectors, and regulatory systems, we would risk leaving companies without the tools they need to act on meaningfully. So, going back to your initial question, what surprised me most was not that farms struggle with biodiversity reporting, but that even the most committed companies lack a clear roadmap. They want to do the right thing, but the framework, metrics, and the regulatory signals are still evolving. That's why the cross country, I think multidisciplinary research is so important, and it helps us to understand where the gaps are, how to close those, without pointing fingers to any one company or sector. It's not fair to say this company is not doing things rightly or they are not taking care of biodiversity, because we are not giving them enough tool to practice biodiversity in their business strategy. Thank you.
Professor, why do firms with higher emissions, water use, and waste often make more ambitious environmental commitments? And how should investors interpret this pattern? Is it progress or sophisticated greenwashing?
Okay. So when you look closely at farms with large environmental footprint, you often see two forces working at the same time. So on one hand, these firms face the strongest pressure from regulators, investors, and communities. So they tend to make the most ambitious commitments, right? On the other hand, they also have the greater opportunity to demonstrate improvement, because even modest operational changes can deliver a visible reduction, right? So the ambition is not always a red flag. Sometimes it reflects where the biggest gain can be made. And for investors, the key is to interpret these commitments as a kind of strategic signaling rather than taking them at face value. So, a company with high emissions may set bold targets to show it understands the scale of its responsibility, and they want to stay ahead of regulatory expectations, which is very common. So that can be a actually positive sign of strategic maturity. But ambition alone is not an evidence of progress. So what really matters is whether the company backs those commitments with credible transition plans and transparent reporting and year on year performance data. So I would say is neither automatically progress nor automatically greenwashing. It's a kind of signal, one that needs to be read alongside the company company's behavior, I would say. So when ambition is matched by investment and is matched by governance and measurable outcomes, it could be a sign of genuine improvement. And when ambition is not matched by action, it becomes symbolic. So then it becomes greenwashing. So the distinction lies in the follow through, not the promise that they are making. Thank you.
Dr. Nandi, you distinguish between strategic signaling and genuine environmental improvement. What indicators or behaviors help us to tell whether a company's biodiversity and climate commitments are mostly symbolic or truly substantive?
Okay. That's very much linked with what I was saying before. So one of the clearest lessons from my research is um, that substance shows up in behavior, not in language. So companies that are genuinely committed, they tend to do few things consistently. So they integrate the biodiversity and climate consideration into core decision making, not just sustainability reports. So you will see that they are considering it in their procurement rules, investment criteria, or board level oversight. So it's everywhere. They report in ways that are specific, that are measurable and comparable, so that anyone can compare. Symbolic commitments often rely on broad phrases like, as I was giving some examples earlier on, supporting nature, enhancing ecosystem. So you will kind of get a feel like something is going wrong there. And they acknowledge the trade-offs, and they demonstrate a continuity. So symbolic commitments tend to appear in response to external pressure, but substantive commitment persists across business cycles. And you can even see that it is evident through leadership changes, that sometimes the companies prefer to change their leadership, the people in the leadership position, because they come with different ideology around sustainability and biodiversity. So, what is particularly important here and still under researched is biodiversity. So, most firms are now highly comfortable in reporting on climate because the metrics are clear. But biodiversity is very complex, and it's more place based, and it's a very sometimes it's very local nature, and is very hard to quantify. That's where I think the gap widens, and many companies express strong intentions, but the reporting is vague because the frameworks are still evolving. Though there are frameworks, which I think we will touch upon later on, but for the research community, this is a very crucial moment. We need more work on how to measure biodiversity performance in a rigorous and comparable manner, and maybe practical for firms operating in different regulatory and ecological context. Without that, I think even well-intentioned companies will struggle to demonstrate that they are progressing. So the distinction between signaling and substance is not about criticizing firms at all. As I'm saying again and again, it's not about criticizing firms. It's about recognizing that clarity, consistency, and sometimes the measurable actions are strongest indicator of genuine commitment, and especially in area of a complex situation like biodiversity. Yeah, thank you.
Professor, climate focused reporting through TCFD is now mainstream, but you have argued that it is still produces an incomplete risk picture when biodiversity is missing. As a policymakers and companies look for ways to reduce the reporting burden by focusing on the most material elements of both PCFD and TNFD. What risks remain invisible when biodiversity is left out? And in practical terms, how does integrating TNFD with TCFD change the way boards and risk committees think about strategy, capital allocation, and disclosure?
Yeah, this question is important because climate and nature risk are no longer separate conversations. So I'm heavily investing my research time in finding out a link between TCFD and TNFD. So, over years, we have seen TCFD has helped companies to understand how the climate change could affect their business. But TNFD is quite new, and TNFD brings the equally important lens, right, on how business depends on nature and how they have some impact on nature, or how the nature is impacting a business and other way around. So when these two are viewed together, boards could finally see the full picture of risk and resilience. To run any business, what we need to consider how we are managing our risk and how we are generating money out of it, right? So the businesses wants to see the full picture, and this is only possible if they are considering TCFD and TNFD together. So without this integration, company may feel that they are reporting extensively, yet still they are missing the issues that could actually disrupt their operations and supply chains or even the long-term value. So what remains invisible when biodiversity is missing? That's the main question over here. I think you were trying to ask. So climate reporting, I would say, alone cannot capture the risk and that arise when the ecosystem is degrading. So there are several critical exposures that stay hidden here, like the declining ecosystem service, such as pollination or soil fertility. So these are not captured in climate metrics, but directly affect our food system, consumer goods, manufacturing, pharmaceutical sectors, every sectors. Then if you think about localized water instability, climate models show temperature and rainfall trends, but they do not explain to you that why rivers lose their buffering capacity, right? When wetlands disappear, or why water treatment costs rise when there is an upstream biodiversity decline, the example that I was giving earlier on. So then, for example, sudden supply chain shocks. So biodiversity loss often trigger abrupt disruptions. So it's like crop failures, and it's a large scale failure situation we would suffer from. Raw material shortage or contamination risk that climate only assessment cannot anticipate. So we need separate reporting, we need more details. Then, say, for example, shifts in land use regulation. Nature related rules are tightening globally, from deforestation, free supply chains to mandatory restoration in some places. But firms that track only climate risk are unprepared for these regulatory changes. So they cannot address those changes or go with those changes. And reputational and market access risk is another big risk. Biodiversity is becoming a mainstream consumer and investor concern. So companies who are ignoring that risk, they will start losing trust in the world market. So this risk are material, but the danger of it is they remain invisible unless you kind of explicitly assess the biodiversity risk. So by integrating the TCFD and TNFD, we can change the boardroom decision And let me explain briefly that how we can do that. So, as we all know that this TCFD, this is a climate related framework, right? If you are not familiar with that. So it was introduced in 2015, and now it's mandatory in different countries, like in EU, is mandatory, UK, Japan, then Singapore, Brazil, even Brazil signed this contract. And then but TNFD was introduced in 2000, I think 23, and then both started using both frameworks together. And if they are using these two things together, then we can see certain shifts in their strategy. One is the strategy becomes more grounded in place. So climate risks are global, but nature risk could be very location specific, and both start asking where their operations are most exposed to those ecosystem decline and which landscape would require investment or stewardship, so they can actually find the region they need to focus on. Then accordingly the capital allocation would also be more meaningful. So companies can begin directing their investment towards that certain reason or certain nature negative situation, or to build a nature positive infrastructure. And um, and they can build their core risk mitigation strategy around that. And the disclosure would also become more decision useful. So TCFD could highlight emission and climate resilience, whereas the TNFD adds more dependencies, more impacts, and talk about ecosystem stability. So together, they are kind of creating a more complete and actionable, I would say, actionable risk profile for anyone. And this integration is not at all increasing the reporting burden for the companies. It's a very important point here, because companies think, oh, okay, I have to report this, that, this, that. So it's not creating more burden on you. It's helping you to focus on the most material intersections of climate and nature. So you know definitely where to focus. And definitely, what I mentioned before is creating some very strategic opportunities. So, companies that adopt both framework, they get several advantages, like they build stronger supply chain, they make their supply chain more resilient, and better they have better access to capital, as investors are increasingly rewarding the firms or businesses with credible nature positive strategies. If you won't have nature positive strategies, you might not attract investors at all. So improved long-term asset value is another important point, especially in sectors that are heavily exposed to land, water, and ecosystem change. And you are actually enhancing trust with regulators, communities, and most important, your customers. So integrating climate and nature is not just about compliance, it is about the competitiveness. And here, through your podcast, I want to leave a message for the regulators, policymakers, and investors. I know beside the academic community, some regulators are also regularly watching your podcast, and because they are also quite lost that what changes needs to be done in the policies. So regulators can definitely play an important role by aligning climate and nature reporting requirements. So companies are not navigating two separate systems. So if the regulator says, okay, this is the combined reporting framework that you need to follow, that's really helpful for the companies, and it's win-win for everyone. And clearer guidance on materiality thresholds would help firms to focus on what truly matters rather than producing long duplicative reports, because this is always a requirement from the businesses, and investors can actually reinforce this by asking the targeted question about nature dependencies. And so for the research community, the next frontier in this biodiversity space is to develop a robust, comparable biodiversity metrics. And climate reporting has already been benefited from decades of work on carbon accounting, carbon finance, and biodiversity needs the same level of methodological clarity. And researcher can help by building this framework that work across the sectors, across the geographies, and so companies can move from broader intention to produce some measurable outcomes. Thank you.
Professor, if you were advising regulators and standard setters, what are the one or two most critical design features needed to ensure that harmonized TCFD, TNFD reporting actually reduces greenwashing rather than just adding another layer of paperwork?
Yeah, so following my previous answers, I would say two design features matter more than anything else. If we harmonize this TCFD, like the climate reporting framework and the nature reporting framework, and it is going to reduce greenwashing, I strongly believe that, and rather than simply expanding the paperwork for the companies. So clarity on what is decision useful and a structure that forces companies to connect their commitment with real outcomes. So when these two elements are very strong, then reporting becomes a strategic tool rather than a compliance burden. So the first design feature should be to make the materiality unambiguous and decision relevant. So the most effective sustainability framework are the ones that tell companies exactly what matters and why. So when materiality is vague, and you would hear lots of discussion around materiality, what matters most to you, and you should report about that. You should invest your resources around that. So when this materiality is vague, firms default to broad statements, and that sound kind of impressive but reveal very little. But when the regulators define a small set of high impact disclosures, those that could genuinely shape the financial resilience, companies' respond will change. Their response will be more sharper, more strategic. They will do more strategic reporting, I would say. I can give you a good example over here from India, where I have been working with the policymakers to develop a four-stage sustainability reporting framework. So during COVID time, there was a consultation going on, and Indian government want to change the reporting framework. And so me, alongside my four other colleagues, we responded to that, and we started developing a framework, which was later on accepted and patented by Indian government, and that became mandatory for top 1000 listed companies in India from 2022. And India became the first country in the world to have a complete reporting framework, because in different countries you will see a reporting framework around climate, around sustainability, other issues around sustainability like modern slavery or so, but there is no mandate around a complete framework. So because the framework is structured around clear material indicators, companies have moved away from generic sustainability language they were using towards a reporting that investors can actually use. And I spoke with very big companies in India who are listed in different other markets too. So they also acknowledge the importance of that strategic change because of a clear instruction, clear model. So we are already already seeing firms can articulate their transition plans more clearly, attract new pools of capital, and not only that, they can demonstrate how sustainability contributes to their local and economic global value, which is really important. So, this shows that when materiality is very well designed, reporting is becoming more catalyst for better strategy, and it never stays as a tick box mechanism, so they are enjoying in reporting, I would say. So in addition to this first point, the second design feature would require alignment between commitment, actions, and definitely the outcomes. So in simple terms, if you ask me, so we have to ensure that this disclosure could link three things: company promises, then the second thing is what it invests in, and the third one would be what actually changes on the ground. So this alignment is where greenwashing, if this alignment is there, then greenwashing is either exposed or it's eliminated. So if a company announces a biodiversity commitment but cannot show where it is acting, what it is funding, or how the ecosystem are responding, you can see the gap, and the gap becomes visible immediately. But when firms demonstrate progress through measurable outcomes, like the model that I was explaining, they were using the model, they were showing that, okay, I gained this much score in this section. So that gives you the measurable outcome, and that improves the water quality, how they are restoring the habitats, or they are reducing the dependency risk. So investor would gain that confidence that the commitments are real. So integrating TCFD and TNFD would strengthen this alignment, because climate and nature risk often reinforce each other, and we shouldn't forget about that. And boards begin to see that emission targets, then water security, land use, and ecosystem health are, and other aspects are not separate issues. They are interconnected with each other, and this interconnection is driving the long term value. So the shift would encourage the companies to embed the nature and climate into their capital allocation and even in their risk management and strategic planning, rather than treating them like I'm doing parallel reporting. And so it's very difficult for the companies. So when reporting frameworks are designed around materiality and outcome alignment, we see very positive, broader impact on markets and policy. How? I would say the investors gain clearer signals, reducing the noise that often fuels accusation of greenwashing. Secondly, companies compete on genuine performance, not on the sophistication of their sustainability language. Like company X said, I'm doing this, good things for the society. Others cannot use that language. It's not the case anymore. And the final and third point would be the regulators can focus enforcement, because the disclosure really matters, and most that's the most easiest thing to verify that whether you are following the regulation or not. So for regulators and standard setters, the priority is not to expand the number of metrics. They always want to strengthen the quality of the ones that matter most. So harmonization, I think, should be simplify, and that shouldn't be multiply. Yeah, thank you.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking ahead, what does an ideal corporate biodiversity commitment look like in 2030? And what governance mechanism or market pressures will we need to make that vision the norm rather than exception?
Okay. You're asking very tricky questions, actually. So, it's very difficult to explain ideal situation. So to me personally, an ideal corporate biodiversity commitment in 2030 is one that will treat nature as a kind of core strategic asset rather than a peripheral responsibility. So I think by then the leading companies will be those who can demonstrate clearly and definitely confidently that how their growth is aligned with the health of the ecosystem they depend on. And that means the commitment grounded in science-based targets, and that should be supported by transparent data, and also this thing should be embedded into board level decision making. It also means that companies will be expected to show that how their actions, not their words, how their actions contribute to resilient landscapes, and like kind of stabilize the supply chains and also contribute to long-term economic value. And they are just not focusing on environmental harm. They can't just say that, okay, I'm not disturbing the environment, but actually they have to show that how they are generating this long-term socioeconomic value. So, to summarize, by 2030, the strongest and ideal commitments will share a couple of characteristics. To me, they are location specific and should be measurable. If I can't measure, if I'm an investor, I would never invest in your business. And recognizing that biodiversity risk and opportunity differ across geographies because it's very different in different countries, and they link investment to outcomes and showing how capital allocation could actually support the ecosystem restoration, water security maybe, and maybe regenerative production system. And they generate the climate and nature, and acknowledging that emission reduction alone cannot secure long-term resilience without healthy soils, without stable water cycles, then how the ecosystem is functioning without taking care of all those things. You cannot just take care of climate change and emission. And I think these commitments will be supported by governance structure where boards should regularly review nature related risk, and where executive incentives should be tied up with those governance measure, because it's really important. If you are not getting financial incentives, you might not be interested to run your business like that way. And this incentive should be tied to measurable improvements in the ecosystem health and also the resource stability maybe. And I think two forces will shape this shift from aspiration to expectation. One is regulatory clarity, which I explained a lot in this discussion, where sustainability reporting frameworks coverage around a small set of high impact decision useful disclosures, not too many things. And investors expectation is another force where capital increasingly flows to companies that can demonstrate credible nature positive strategies and long-term resilience. It's not only I'm taking some strategies which are nature positive, but how I'm building long-term resilience. That's important. And these are the things actually the investors are looking for. So we are already seeing those dynamics in practice. Like the example I gave before, it shows how well-designed governance, because that structure was the governance structure, and can the how a proper well-designed governance structure can shift the corporate behavior at scale. So if companies, while worldwide, if they adopt the similar strategic approaches, the benefit could extend far beyond the compliance, and we can actually see true economic, socio-economic impact actually. So, for example, we can see more resilient food and water system, which will reduce volatility for households and business during this unsettled time. Then during this high inflation and market uncertainty, if we can see a more resilient system, it would be better for us. Then we can see stronger local economies, as nature positive investment could create jobs in restoration, in monitoring, and we might get sustainable production cycle that's good for everyone in the society. And greater investors confidence is really important. As markets gets clearer signals about long-term risk and opportunity, there would be more investment, which we desperately need in this world. And overall, the healthier ecosystem, which underpin everything from public health to national productivity. Everything is heavily dependent on how we are navigating these challenges. So this is not just an environmental agenda, I would say. It is an economic stability agenda, which we really need now. And just to conclude that my role as part of the research community is very important over here. And as a researcher working closely with policymakers and businesses, my contribution is to help build the evidence base and the practical framework that makes these commitments credible. So the work with Indian regulators has shown me how powerful it can be when academic insights, policy design, and corporate practice come together. And I see my role as helping other countries and industries building similar pathways, ones that are rigorous, I would say, context specific, and aligned with global expectations, because environment biodiversity is a global agenda, right? And this is not about promoting myself. So it is not about recognizing that it is not about saying what I did. So it is mainly about recognizing that the research community has a responsibility to support governments and businesses as they navigate this transition. And we can help them actually. And we can help them to design the metrics, test the framework, and create the knowledge infrastructure that will allow the companies to act with confidence. With that, I will conclude my discussion with you. Thank you.
Professor Monomita Nandy, thank you for joining us today and for sharing such thoughtful, practice-relevant perspectives. We truly appreciated the clarity and depth you brought to the conversation and the way you connected research, policy, and real-world impact. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. If you found this episode valuable, do share it with your network and subscribe for more conversations like this. Professor Nandi, it's been a privilege having you with us and we look forward to staying in connected. Thank you once again.
Thank you again for inviting me, and it was a pleasure to share insights on the topic that will define our shared future. Thank you.